Hi there, I'm Kristina, and I'm an art history nerd. Join me each week as I hop, skip, and jump around the globe to explore the world of art. This is Tidbits, pocket sized art history. Okay, before we get too far into this, I have a disclaimer to make. I am not an art historian. I took lots of art history classes in college, and I love them, and I nerd out, I read articles, but I'm not an academic scholar on the subject. I'm kind of like a fangirl. So keep that in mind as we go through this whole series. I had a really fantastic professor in my undergrad for art history. His name was Dr. Sam Watson, and he's still teaching there today. Great work. Shout out to Dr. Watson. He totally got me hooked on the subject. He's a really fantastic storyteller, and in the end, that's kind of what art history is all about, is telling stories visually. So that's kind of how I got into all of this. For real, this whole Tidbits project is sort of an employer sanctioned geek out over what I find fascinating and cool about art history. So thank you, River Arts. This isn't really meant to be a scholarly resource. This presentation is kind of entertainment, maybe a little bit educational, and just something to pique your interest. Let's get started. Breaking news. I am not testing you on any of this. You don't need to memorize the dates, the names, the isms, and everything that I'm going to throw at you. I think that's maybe where a lot of people get scared off from art history, is they get overwhelmed by an information dump. And I don't want that to be how this goes. I will provide the information as it's helpful to see the artworks that we're going to talk about in context, but none of it's mandatory. So you're not going to be tested, and I hope you enjoy some of it. Before we get into a specific artwork, there are a couple of myths and misconceptions that I would like to clear up around the whole subject. What is art and why do we look at it? Who gets to call themselves an artist? Why study art history at all? These are some important questions that I think we need to address. And the first thing is that there's not really a right answer to this. You know, a lot of art history classes will start with a timeline in prehistoric art, and then you march in a straight line through the Western canon until you end up through Egypt, Italy, France, US. End timeline. It's a straight line from one to the other. And we all probably know that that's not really how it works. Art history is a massive interconnecting web of influences, war zones, human evolution. It's not a straight line. And so that is not how it's going to be presented for me. I'd like to clear some of it up and let you know that this is my approach to art history and how I can do it in this format. It's not academic, it's just entertainment, and it's what I enjoy looking at and what I enjoy studying. Myth number 1. Art history is not relevant to me. False. The tragedy here is that most US high school educations do not include any kind of art history at all. Even a lot of higher education institutions offer art history as an optional elective at best, unless you're an art major. In reality, art history is the visual representation of human history. Are you a human? I hope so, watching this. If yes, then art history applies to you. It's your history. There's a quote by an art historian named Jesse Bryant Wilder, and it says, "If written history is humankind's diary, then art history is humankind's mirror." Art history shows us who we were, what we valued, what frightened us, and how we've evolved over time. Art history can teach us so much about the history of our species, from even before the written word. The earliest known cave paintings predate human writing by 26,000 years. Thousand! Think about how much growth and context is created in that amount of time. Think about it this way. The US is 245 years old this year. Imagine if we only started writing down our history 14 years ago. 2007. How much history and culture goes missing just because it wasn't written down as words? Am I nerding out yet? I'm nerding out. Bear with me. Myth number 2. Art history is stuffy, boring, and only important to rich snobs. False. Art is rebellious and emotional and awe-inspiring and confusing and absolutely critical to a healthy society and individual. Does this mean that you have to like and agree with all art ever created? Absolutely not. Between you and me, I'm not actually Picasso's biggest fan, which sort of feels like admitting I don't like puppies, but it's just a personal preference of mine, and sorry you're watching my show, so you're gonna hear about my personal preferences. Please don't revoke my art degree for that one. Do you like every kind of food that's created because you like to eat? No, you're allowed to have preferences, and a lot of that is based on what you've been exposed to. For us, that typically means the Western canon of art history, typically highlighted by ancient prehistoric art leading into Egyptian, swing through the Italian Renaissance, take a turn at French Impressionism, and end up in New York City. And then everything after about 1961 gets shoved into one category called postmodernism, and then that's it. Let's consider my little show here your personal helping of art history broccoli. Let's find new ways to explore and appreciate art together that you maybe haven't had before. So, the communication of ideas can take many shapes and forms. The same way that you learned how to read and write in kindergarten, you can learn how to read a work of art. In its simplest form, art is visual storytelling. Your brain learns visual cues from a young age, and you can often put together a narrative based on even the smallest amount of information. Are you someone who says, I can only draw stick figures? Perfect. Then you know how to use imagery to tell a story. You don't have to put every detail out there. Your brain will assemble from the information it has and draw from past experience to create the rest of the story. Comic strips, notebook doodles, road maps, even the Sistine Chapel, they all share a visual language that you've learned how to read since you were a kid. There are 2 main ways to look at a work of art. Technically, there's a lot more than that, but I'm just going to focus in on 2. There's formal analysis and iconographic analysis. Formal analysis means you are only looking at what you can see. Essentially, your analysis stops at the borders of the picture frame. You're looking at the colors, the line, the shape, the pattern, brush strokes. That's it. You're only looking at what's on the surface. That's all you have to go by. Iconographic analysis means you're pulling in context. You're looking at the biographical information of who made the work, the historical context of when they made it, what was going on in the world when it was made, what could it possibly be referencing, and you're looking at symbols that have been expressed throughout the day. So maybe a dove is in the picture. Well, does that mean a presence of a Holy Spirit, or does it mean a dove? That's where those 2 types of analysis kind of separate. What you see, and then what you know about the background of it. It's important to realize that those 2 systems often work together. Neither one on their own is a perfect tool. So we're going to use parts of both to build on each other and work on that with our analysis. Here comes the school part. Again, I'm not going to test you on this, but there's some vocabulary that I think is really going to be helpful as we go down the line and as we work with different pieces of artwork. Up first is design. Everyone probably knows this word. Technically, it means the arrangement of visual elements in a work of art. These are intentional choices by the artist that they use to help communicate their ideas. Focal point. The area in the composition to which the viewer's eye is naturally drawn. Think of it like the climax of a movie or the crescendo of a song. This is the point of the work that your eyes are absolutely drawn to first. That's what you're supposed to notice. Rhythm. A repetition of elements that suggests movement. So yes, visual art can have rhythm just like music, but instead of something that makes you tap your foot or nod your head, Visual rhythm helps your eyes move across an image at a set speed and in a set direction. Think of looking at a piece of art where it's a tree-lined road, and the trees are spaced pretty equally distant as it takes you back into the piece. They guide your eye back at a set speed in a set direction. So we'll practice picking out visual rhythm as we go along. Lastly, for this section is symbolism. This is kind of the big one. Visually, symbolism is defined as something that stands for or suggests something else by reason of relationship, association, convention, or accidental resemblance. It's kind of a word salad, but we know that art is visual shorthand for storytelling, right? So it stands that symbols become a visual language shared across a culture. By learning about the historical context and social cues that were around a piece of art during its creation, you could learn the social, symbolic language of a certain place and time. So there are some examples you already know from our place and time. Examples being a heart equaling love, or a skull equaling death. In ancient Greece, the owl was the symbol of Athena and the city of Athens. It stood for knowledge and wisdom and truth. Owls in paintings often referred to the subject, that person having wisdom or in the pursuit of knowledge. Over time, that symbol transformed and became sort of ironic. If there was an owl over a person in a painting, it meant they were often a fool in search of knowledge, in search of wisdom. So not to complicate things too much, but symbols can evolve over time, just like our spoken words can evolve. So that's part of the iconographic analysis of a piece, is knowing what that symbol would mean when it was made, not necessarily what it means now. So kind of complicated, but we'll practice, don't worry. So, with all of that being said, let's practice on one. Did you really think I was going to start anywhere else? This is the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. She is perhaps the most famous work of art of all time. Of course, we had to start with her. This is a great piece to start with because nearly everyone recognizes her face and that enigmatic smile that she wears. Let's talk about a little bit of background for this painting. The Mona Lisa is an oil painting. It's painted on wooden panel by Italian artist, inventor, and writer Leonardo da Vinci. The piece was likely completed in 1506. Features a portrait of a seated woman set against an imaginary landscape background. It's painted similarly to Renaissance portrayals of the Virgin Mary. It features a female figure believed to be Lisa Gherardini, the wife of cloth and silk merchant Francesco Giocondo. In Italy and France, the name of this piece is La Gioconda, which is kind of a cue for who it might be. I apologize for my Italian pronunciation. Let's just leave it at that. Behind her is a hazy landscape. It's painted sort of fuzzy and unclear. This was done on purpose. It's a technique called sfumato. It means smoky. It means it kind of softens hard lines and edges where things that are further away appear blurry and kind of pale and gray. So it helps denote distance. That technique also means you zero in your focus on the figure's face. The figure sits with her arms folded as she gazes at the viewer and appears to softly smile. This smile has captured audiences for a really long time. She's kind of half smiling, half not. Sometimes it changes based on the way you look at it. This painting, while widely considered a masterpiece, wasn't actually famous until it was stolen in the summer of 1911. Prior to that, she was hung on a random wall in the Louvre with dozens of other paintings considered beautiful and well done, but not necessarily revolutionary the way it is today. After it was returned 2 years after being stolen, the public rushed in to see what was so special about this piece among all the masterworks in the Louvre that made it worth stealing. And that's part of what's added to its reputation today and why it's so famous. I highly recommend listening to the first episode of a podcast called Art Curious by Jennifer Dassel. She goes into really great depth on when this piece was stolen, what happened, who was involved. I won't go into all of that on this episode, but I highly recommend that podcast if you want to learn more about when it was stolen. Part of what makes this piece so unique is her clothing. While nice and beautiful, it's sort of unremarkable. And if you look at other portraits of the day, people are decked out. This is when you wear your jewels, your silks, your extremely expensive clothing and jewelry to kind of prove how rich you are and how powerful you are. The simplicity of her dress provides contrast to the great detail that's in her face and in the background. Let's talk focal point. What do you think the focal point of this artwork is? Traditionally speaking, the focal point of this artwork is her eyes. Let's look at the composition. She's painted in a pyramid shape, right? So it's sort of a triangle where her head is the top. This pyramid-shaped composition provides a really solid, stable base. The bottom feels nice and solid. It's darker in color. There's a little less detail. That feels grounded. Because all visual lines lead up and ending in her head, it draws your eyes up into her face. Because the portrait is painted only from the waist up, it kind of eliminates a lot of the background and it's zoomed in on her. She is very clearly the foreground, taking up the most space. You have nowhere else to look, really. You have to start with her face. Making portraits from the waist up was kind of revolutionary at that time. After this piece, the waist-up portrait became the norm for the next 400 years. Like, this was a trend-setting painting. Also, the fact that she is looking boldly back out at the audience is another groundbreaking feature of this work. In normal paintings of the day, aristocratic women were portrayed looking after children, supervising household staff, or gazing downward or upward in prayer. This piece, Mona Lisa looking calm, self-assured, and slightly pleased with herself, was almost scandalous for the day. So her expression even was something revolutionary. Let's talk background. The imagery that you see was imagined by Da Vinci, and much is written about the supposed symbolism of the 3 tiers. In the foreground, aka the part closest to us as the viewers, we can see a path that's right here and a bridge over here. These are clearly man-made objects, and we know them as symbols of journeys, of transition, of change, venturing off into the unknown. The curves of her hair and clothing are repeated in the winding curves of the road behind her. This connects humanity and nature. This theme, connecting mankind and nature, was a favorite theme of Leonardo's and comes up quite often in his other artworks. In the middle tier, the horizon line does not quite line up on either side of her head. Here. On our left, the horizon line is quite a bit lower than on our right. This conflicting visual information makes the eye want to connect the line, but that means that if your eye does that automatically, that makes her shoulders off kilter, because those are in line. This adjustment between the 2 planes, which should be level but are not, leads to a sense of movement. You're kind of going back and forth with your eye, trying to connect the 2 lines. The farthest tier has a hazy gray and slightly blurry appearance. In the background is what appears to be icy mountains or a waterway. This is the wild unknown, the untamed nature, maybe the foreboding of an unknown future. It's far away, it's unclear, and it's totally unknown. I encourage you to spend some more time looking at this piece on your own. Take a look at the background, the clothing, the composition, anything that interests you, really. What catches your eye? So much of art we look at and then dismiss, but where are your eyes drawn to first? Which direction does your gaze move around the piece? You don't have to direct it, but pay attention to where it wants to go on its own. There were lots of conscious decisions made by the artist, so by practicing looking at this piece of art, you can imagine yourself in conversation with Da Vinci himself. What was he trying to do and portray? I think that's kind of cool and one of my favorite parts about looking at art. All right, I think I've maybe talked your ear off enough for week 1. My name is Kristina, and this has been the first episode of Tidbits, Pocket-Sized Art History. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned a little something. Join me next time. We're going to dive into a piece of ancient art and kind of start in the beginning a little bit. Thanks so much. Take care. I'm curious to know what you thought of this. Please drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. What are you curious to learn more about in future episodes? Is there a famous work of art that you want me to talk about down the road? Is there a work of art that you hate that you want me to talk about? Let me know. I'm curious. This is open, and I can't wait to see what you think.